Welcome to Past People. Get ready for a roller coaster of a tale as we delve into the sad and intriguing life of King George I, the most hated monarch in British history. From family conflicts to dark secrets, George's reign was filled with drama, making him a controversial figure in the annals of British royalty. We'll explore King George I's tumultuous life, from his troubled childhood and strained family relationships to a questionable marriage and the mysterious disappearance of a rival. George's story takes unexpected turns, so buckle up for a journey into the complexities of power, love, and betrayal. King George I is remembered as the most disliked monarch in British history, and for good reason. George was sly, arrogant, and had a cruel streak that even his own family couldn't escape. His reign was full of turmoil, from rebellions to family conflicts, painting a bleak picture of his time as king. Born into power, but not in England, George I was the first son of German nobles. He was originally meant to inherit lands in the Holy Roman Empire from his father, Ernest Augustus. However, things didn't go as planned, leading to a troubled reign in Britain. Originally named George Ludwig, the German nobleman changed his name to George Rex during his coronation in England over 50 years later. This change was a response to the widespread condemnation of his foreign birth, a desperate attempt to win the support of his new subjects. George I and his brother Frederick Augustus were inseparable as children. However, this close bond only made their future rift more heartbreaking, adding to the misery of George's story. George's mother, Sophia of Hanover, fell ill when he was young, leading her to spend a year in warmer climates for recovery. The absence of a proper parenting during this time left a lasting impact on George. He developed a somber personality marked by introspection and sensitivity, which haunted his public image later in life. Despite showing promise as a leader, George's quiet nature and sense of responsibility as the eldest child created challenges. While praised by his mother for being dutiful and reliable, these traits had negative consequences as well, contributing to the overall misery of his life. Being the oldest child came with perks for George. His father, Ernest Augustus, gave him lots of attention and prepared him for a fancy life. They did things like hunting and riding together, and George learned all about living like an aristocrat. His siblings didn't get the same treatment, and his favoritism caused big problems. Besides the fun activities with his dad, George also had to face dangerous challenges. In the late 1600s, Europe was full of conflicts, and Ernest Augustus knew that his boys might have to fight. So during the Franco-Dutch War, he took the introverted 15-year-old George into battle. It's surprising George didn't end up more messed up from this experience. George was his father's favourite, and in 1683 his father declared that only George could inherit the relatives' lands. This caused a massive family feud, especially with his brother Frederick Augustus. The sibling rift grew over time, but George had bigger problems on the horizon. In 1682, George got engaged to Sophia Dorothea, his cousin. It wasn't a perfect match, though. George's mother worried about Sophia's lower social status, but George had a sneaky plan. George wasn't just in love with his cousin, he had a cunning reason to court her. Sophia's dowry promised more lands for George once they were married. He convinced his ambitious mother to approve the match, but soon everyone regretted it. After getting married, George and Sophia's relationship fell apart. Despite having 2 kids by 1687, they were completely estranged. George spent more time with his mistress than his wife, but it was a two-way street, and Sophia was no stranger to infidelity. Feeling neglected by George, Sophia had an affair with the Swedish Count Philip Christoph. This caused a major uproar. While George got away with his extramarital affairs, Sophia faced the royal family's disapproval, and things got even more interesting from here. George's wife had a strong connection with the Count, and the royal family worried that they might run away together, which would embarrass George. To avoid that, they pressured Sophia to break up with her lover. When she refused, things took a darker turn. In July 1694, George's problems with the Count conveniently vanished in a very violent way. The Count disappeared, and George was suspected to be behind it. Rumours suggested George's family paid people to harm the lover, either dumping his body in a river or burying him under the palace floorboards. George's true colours were showing, but he wasn't finished with his wife. Not content with the murder of Sophia's lover, George ended his marriage with her, claiming that she had abandoned him. Despite the irony, he went further. With her father's permission, George locked Sophia in the house, far from Hanover, showing his power over her. Sophia remained in royal prison for 30 years, with George denying her her basic rights. He forbade her from remarrying, going into town without supervision, and even kept her away from her own children. Once shy, George had become a harsh ruler, showing no signs of stopping. In a twist of fate, George became the heir to the English throne after locking up his ex-wife. Prince William, the current heir, died unexpectedly, causing a crisis. The Protestant English court overlooked many Catholic potential successors, and George, the next male Protestant in line, inherited the throne. However, it came at a cost. George's mother, Sophia of Hanover, was next in line for the crown, healthier than the current Queen Anne of England. However, Anne didn't want to lose the throne to Sophia and sent a harsh letter. Devastated, Sophia fell ill and eventually passed away. George gained a higher position in the Game of Thrones, but lost his beloved mother. Was it worth it? Spoiler, no. When Queen Anne passed away in 1714, George finally became the king at the age of 54. People called him Lucky George because they never expected this older German man to be their king. However, George's luck didn't last long, as challenges awaited him. Learning he was now the King of Great Britain, George didn't want to give up his easy life in Hanover. Instead of acting like a king, he partied across Europe. His delayed arrival in his new kingdom, coupled with his careless behaviour, did not sit well with the British people. When George finally arrived for his coronation, chaos erupted. Angry riots broke out across England, with people destroying things and causing bloody clashes. Many couldn't accept a foreigner as their king. George faced a humiliating welcome at Westminster Abbey. To the English, George seemed like a country bumpkin. As he approached the Abbey for his coronation, the angry crowd labelled him Turnip King. One protester was even detained for waving a turnip on a stick. George likely didn't understand the insults, mainly because of a crucial reason. During his coronation, things got awkward fast. George, who didn't speak English, struggled to grasp the ceremony's rituals. He relied on Latin and French, stumbling through the day with the help of his aides. When people learned that he couldn't understand their language, his reputation plummeted, and he did little to fix it. In addition to the language barrier, the British formed unflattering opinions about George based on German stereotypes. One belief claimed George accepted any woman who was willing, fat, and had a large breast. While this might have been gossip, some scandalous incidents at his coronation added fuel to the fire. On his coronation day, George's attention was split between two women, one very thin and the other more curvy. The crowd noticed this, calling them the elephant and the maypole. Gossip spread that the king's insatiable lust needed two partners. However, the truth about one woman was quite different. The curvier woman was George's half-sister, and despite the scandalous rumours, there was no romance between them. However, the thin woman was George's longtime mistress. Their relationship caused quite a stir. Though George and his mistress never married, everyone who knew him recognised her as his true love. They had 3 illegitimate children and stayed together throughout their lives. Future Prime Minister Robert Walpole even called her as much the Queen as there was ever, showing George needed all the allies that he could get. To ease tension, George surrounded himself with familiar faces in his new court. His closest aides were Turks that he had captured in battle. They kept English courtiers at bay, preventing them from taking important royal positions. However, this strategy didn't go as planned. As news about the new king spread in British high society, the gossip and laughter behind his back grew. George's secretive behaviour was misunderstood, and the English court labelled him with demeaning nicknames like Honest Blockhead, Corpulent Oaf, and King Log. The aristocracy was not impressed. George's reign in Britain was a humbling experience. Unlike in Hanover, he didn't have absolute control. Parliament had to approve most major changes, and this lack of control made George very uneasy and prone to making bad decisions. George wanted to go back to Hanover, but being king kept him away. He managed occasional visits, but spent a fifth of his rule on pleasure trips to his homeland. In the end, he might have needed to focus more on the throne. In the first year of George's rule, a big rebellion threatened his power. The Jacobites, a group from Scotland, tried to kick George out and make the son of King James II of England the new king. They even raised a small army, but luckily for George, they were defeated. You'd think this would make George look good, but nope. After stopping the rebellion, people were curious about what George would do next. Unfortunately, he made a big mistake. Instead of punishing the rebels, he decided to be merciful. While that's nice, it made his subjects think that he was weak, and the insults kept coming. George didn't handle this very well. Tired of all the mean comments, George started acting very unkingly. The reclusive king avoided being in public as much as possible. He sneaked around London in disguise for late-night card games and hid in the shadows during opera visits. His popularity took another hit. While George struggled socially, his son, George Augustus, thrived in British society. The younger man claimed to have no drop of blood that was not English. A lie, for sure, but a big problem for King George. Jealous of his son's popularity, King George tried to change his ways. In an unusual move, he started dining in public in 1717, sometimes with 50 guests. He tried to impress the British people by spending money in extravagant ways over the next few years. George spent most of his time at Hampton Court Palace in England, a historic estate. The palace already had many features, but George made crazy changes to outshine his son's popularity. He turned the Great Hall into a theatre and the tennis court into a grand assembly room. When that didn't impress enough, he tried another desperate measure. One calm summer evening, George I floated on the Thames River on a fancy boat with his courtiers. While on this pleasure cruise, German composer Handel played the water music suites. It was a luxurious moment, but with King George there was always more going on than it seemed. The water music show was a big show-off move. Historians still argue about who came up with the idea. Some say George asked Handel to write it to boost his popularity. Another story claims Handel wrote it to mend their friendship after a falling out. But not all of George's fights got fixed. When George's son had a baby in 1717, the king was happy at first. Then things went bad. To help his son, the king picked Thomas Pelham Holles as a baptism sponsor. There was a big problem. The Prince of Wales didn't like Lord Chamberlain, and this led to a disaster. During the baby's christening, chaos erupted. The young father insulted the Lord Chamberlain, who took it as a challenge to a duel. King George's careful plans for his son blew up, and he didn't waste time throwing a tantrum. After the blow-up, King George kicked his son out of the palace. He went a step further. He kept his son and daughter-in-law from seeing their own kids for months, insisting the children stay with him. Like with his ex-wife, George I's revengeful side showed up, and there was no turning back. George's harsh punishment made his son desperate. One day the son and his wife sneaked into the palace to catch a glimpse of their children. When they saw them, Caroline passed out, and the heir cried like a child. Although King George later made up, the damage was done. Over the next years, George Augustus grew angrier at his father. His London house became a base for the king's political rivals. Newspapers loved it, printing pages of royal family feud gossip and eagerly anticipating King George's death. But before that, a dangerous scandal unfolded. While George was in Hanover, his courtiers, including his mistress, caused a stock market crash in the South Sea bubble. It turned into a catastrophe. People blamed George for everything. Then things got deadly. As George rushed back to England, blame games got intense. In a heated debate, one of the king's allies, Lord Stanhope, collapsed and died of a heart attack. Eventually, the South Sea bubble calmed, but George had little to do with it. By then, the king was on to one last strange amusement. After the chaos from the market crisis settled, George sailed to Hanover to escape his problems. While hunting in Germany, he stumbled upon a feral child in the woods. Surviving without human contact, the boy's wild behaviour surprised the hunting party. Despite the shock, the king felt sympathy for the child's inability to communicate. With his usual brilliant ideas, George brought the boy back to Britain, naming him Peter the Wild Boy. The king tried to improve his life by raising him with royal luxuries. Unfortunately, it turned disgraceful, and the boy became a mere spectacle at court. Despite facing public slander, George was open to different opinions, possibly because he didn't understand English very well. He supported free speech and offered refuge to the writer Voltaire when France threatened to imprison him in 1726. However, not all writers were the king's allies. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels humorized George's court. In the novel, George I is portrayed as the emperor of the tiny Lilliputian people, and political discussions are comically compared to the arguments over shoe height. You can't win them all. In 1760, longing for Hanover, George set out for his homeland, but never arrived. While enjoying strawberries in his royal coach, he suffered a sudden fit and never recovered. At the border of Germany, King George I passed away at 67 due to a stroke. Throughout his reign, George wished to be back in his native land, and after his death, he was buried in the chapel of Lane Palace in Hanover, becoming the last British monarch laid to rest overseas. When King George I died, people expected his son, King George II, to pay respects in Germany. Instead, he stayed in London, choosing England over his father. This revenge made him popular, and George Jr. finally won the popularity contest. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey into the life of King George I. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button, subscribe for more captivating historical content, and ring the notification bell to stay updated.